Good afternoon and welcome to CUHK Law and the latest and our greatest, Greater China Legal History seminar series. My name is Stephen Gallagher and it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker to you today. Let me just say at the very beginning though, a warm welcome to all of you. We have a phenomenal number of people registered today, nearly breaking our Zoom registration numbers. So well over 1,000 people registered. Should expect it with the speaker we have today, obviously. But thank you for joining us. I've just been looking through the list of people who've joined us, many present and some former colleagues, many present students, and of course, lots of our alumni join us as well. So to all of you, welcome to CUHK Law and the Greater China Legal History Seminar Series. So yes, so many people registered, a great topic, but of course, a great speaker. So it's my pleasure to introduce to you my colleague and of course the co-founder of the Greater China Legal History Seminar Series, Professor Lutz-Christian Wolff. I should say, by the way, that he was the prime mover. It was his idea really to set up this seminar series. So it's appropriate that we celebrate such large numbers of registrations today. So Professor Lutz-Christian Wolff is the Weilun Professor of Law at CUHK Law. He specializes in international and Chinese business law, comparative law and private international law, and is admitted to practice in England and Wales as well as in Germany. Lutz is a founding member of CUHK Law, and he's served, well, in many different roles within the faculty and of course within the university, but of course as the CUHK Law Dean from 2019 to 2024, and as Dean of the CUHK Graduate School from 2014 to 2019. His interest in legal history was really the prime mover in the development of these seminars. So it's very appropriate for me now to hand over to Lutz to present to you today on the legal regime of journal colonialism in China. Lutz, over to you.
Thank you, Steve. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for joining. We had many Greater China legal history seminars dealing with legal aspects of British colonialism in China. And the British had, of course, been the first to force the Qing court to accept concessions after the Treaty of Nanking, after the First Opium War. But other countries have bullied their way into China as well. Russia, France, Japan, Austria, Hungary, Belgium, Italy. And there were also the Germans. And this is my topic today, the legal regime of German colonial activities in China. Allow me to share my slides first. Is that okay, Steve?
Yes, you're good.
Good. All right. Thank you. The German Reich, the German Empire, had concessions in Tianjin, Hankou, and of course Jiaozhou, where Qingdao, with Qingdao as a center. Germany was also involved in Shanghai at some point, but I will focus on the three concessions that I've just mentioned today. For the preparation of today's talk, I've relied heavily on the work of others. The most important sources are set out on this chart. I have especially enjoyed the book by Thorsten Warner, German Architecture in China, published in 1994. Apologies for the bad photo. The book is written in German, in English, and in Chinese. Many great photos, but a lot of background information as well about the German involvement in China. Then I have benefited a lot from Jonathan Canby's book, The Siege of Tsingtao. It's a tiny book published by Penguin about the Battle of Tsingtao, the only armed conflict in the Far East during the First World War. And finally, the best source in terms of legal aspects is the paper by George Steinmetz, Qingdao as a Colony from Apartheid to Civilization Exchange, published in 2009. I've quoted that on the previous chart. Special thanks finally go to my friend Liu Ping, my former roommate from about more than 40 years ago in Shanghai, an accomplished historian and a walking encyclopedia. The discussions we had over the time were as eye-opening as it has helped to prepare for the talk today. Before I start to discuss the German activities in China, I wish to clarify some terms, some language, some concepts. First, terminology. Over time, different styles are used to transcribe Chinese names, have been used. And for today on my chart, you will find the style that was used in Germany back in the times about which I will speak today. But also pinyin, of course, I will use. So Qingdao becomes Tsingtao and Jiaozhou becomes Kiaochao. I hope we will manage. I will in the following also use certain terms and talk about concepts describing the form of foreign colonial operations in China and elsewhere. And I wish to clarify 5 concepts up front, which you have here. These terms, these concepts are not, the terminology is not used consistently, and the terms do not necessarily have a technical meaning. And that's why I believe it's important to consider them. Colony first, the term colony is normally understood as a country or part of a country permanently under the full political control with transfer of full sovereignty to another country. Often this comes with segregation. That means the indigenous people are separated from the foreign rulers, from the colonial power and their representatives. Cession means the assignment of property, territory, for example, to another person or entity. In international law, it often refers to land voluntarily or under the use of force transferred based on an international treaty. And that means that a cession can lead to a colony, of course. A concession is the grant of some right. And in the context of our topic today, concession means an act by which the state transfers all or some sovereign rights or functions to a foreign party, normally not permanently, but for a certain period of time. And in China, the term concession was, of course, also used for the geographical area where exactly that happened, where sovereign rights were transferred to foreign powers. If a concession also implies the transfer of full sovereignty, then there is de facto no difference between a concession and a colony. International settlements are foreign-controlled and jointly administered extraterritorial zones, areas like the Shanghai International Settlement previously and the Gulangyu Settlement in Xiamen and Amoy. And finally, the standard term used at the time discussed today in Germany for all overseas territories where the Germans were involved was Schutzgebiet, protectorate. Then again, terminology is used inconsistently. Colloquially, everybody talks about German colonies in China, but Germany did not have any colonies in the technical sense because Kiaochao, Tianjin, and Hankou were only leased territories. They were leased for 99 years with the transfer of sovereign rights, so they were concessions actually. And when I talk about German colonialism in China today, I therefore use this term in a non-technical sense. Now, before I talk about the German activities, the concessions in China, with a focus on the legal aspects, of course, let me remind ourselves of the general historic background. We're talking about a time, the 19th and the first half of the 20th century, which was a time of trauma for the Chinese Empire as the balance of power in East Asia changed dramatically to the disadvantage of China, as Fenley has put it. In the late 19th century, the dominant figure in China was Empress Dowager Cixi, a conservative whose main concern was to keep the imperial system alive. Qing rulers were foreigners from Manchuria and increasingly unpopular amongst the Han Chinese. Some historians even claim that Qing rulers were not Chinese rulers, but foreign rulers of China. A great book about Empress Dowager Cixi is the biography by Jun Chang, a good and easy and very interesting read. But let's look at Germany first before discussing China. On the 18th of January 1871, 25 German states had established the German Empire, the Reich. Prussia was one of the four kingdoms that joined. 2/3 of the empire's population lived in Prussia. The constitution of the German Empire reflected this Prussian dominance. The king of Prussia was also the German emperor. You see here how much of the German Reich was Prussia. Germany had a population of 41 million at the time. During the time of the German Empire, Germany developed quickly, became the largest economy in Europe and the third largest in the world. It lasted only until 1918, when Germany became a republic after the November Revolution. Germany was a latecomer as a colonial power, but Germany's emperor, Kaiser Wilhelm II, was very ambitious and wanted to catch up with the other colonial powers. Here's a summary of where the German Reich established itself, where they had colonial engagements. As you can see, it was mainly Africa, Polynesia, Pacifics, and of course, China. What was the legal framework of the colonial activities of the German Empire? The prevailing public international law at the time, which was of course a product of European ambitions, provided the basis for colonization in the form of the doctrine of discovery. European states conferred upon each other the right to colonize, and the colonized states or territories and their populations were not asked. According to the German Imperial Constitution of 1871, the power to deal with colonial issues, and we are now looking at German domestic law, was with the federal government. From 1899 onwards, therefore, all German protectorates were under the direct administration of the Reich, and within the German Foreign Office, a Reichskolonial Office, the Reichskolonialamt, was in charge. Only Jiaozhou with Qingdao in China had a special arrangement. It was a naval base and therefore administered by the Imperial Naval Office, the Reichsmarineamt, as I will explain later. The main legal basis in Germany for colonial outbound activities was the Protectorate Law, the Schutzgesetz of 1886. The Protectorate Law regulated the legal relationships in the colonies, including civil and criminal court systems, the applicability of German law, domestic law, labor and property law, citizenship, mixed marriages, and so on. You have a summary of the key points of the Protectorate Law and other laws enacted over time on this chart. As we will see later, they are mirrored in what the legal situation was in Germany's concessions. And with this, I'm now coming to China. I had mentioned that the German Emperor, Kaiser Wilhelm II, was keen to catch up with other colonial powers and push for German overseas colonial activities. Here you have him. That was Kaiser Wilhelm II. And you have also a quote that he from Kaiser Wilhelm. Hundreds of German merchants will shout with joy in the knowledge that the German Empire has at long last set foot firmly in Asia. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese will shiver if they feel the iron fist of the German Empire lying firmly on their neck. And this gives a bit of feel of what was about to come. Back in Germany, the China policy of the German Reich was, by the way, not completely undisputed. In September of the year 1900, the German Social Democrats stated at a party congress in Mainz, the China policy is led by a militaristic obsession to conquest, chauvinistic hunger for land, and capitalist interest of the bourgeoisie. In November of the same year, August Bebel, then the head of the German Social Democrats, asked, "Do you really believe that any people in the world would allow anything similar to what we have done over many years to the Chinese?" But these were lone voices. Let's look now at Germany's three concessions in China. I will focus on Kiaozhou because, as you will see, Tianjin and Hankou were really small. After several exploratory expeditions, the Germans had identified Kiaozhou Bay as a perfect place to establish a naval base in China. And following the Treaty of Shimonoseki, which had ended the First Sino-Japanese War, German envoys had tried to convince China to grant Germany a harbor, but they were unsuccessful. In spring 1896, Grand General Alfred von Tirpitz, who later became the head of the German naval operations, all of Germany, conducted another inspection tour to find the best collation. And again, he selected Kiaozhou. In 1896, then Berlin offered to buy the area again, but the Chinese government rejected again. And in November of the same year, the Emperor Kaiser Wilhelm II therefore instructed Admiral Eduard von Knorr to prepare a plan for the occupation of Kiaozhou Bay. Then, on the 1st of November, the perfect casus belli, as Pembe has called it, happened. The Zhuyi incident. Two German Catholic missionaries named Henle and Nies from the Societas Verbi Divini were murdered in Zhuyi County at the southeastern part of coast of Shandong. It's actually not absolutely clear who was behind the killings. It's mostly assumed that this was done by the members of the Big Sword Society, the Dada Hui. The Big Sword Society had coordinated the fight against foreign powers in Shandong since 1886. The Big Sword Society is sometimes confused with the Boxers, the Ichotuan, but the Big Sword Society was an earlier separate peasant group, also anti-Christian, and it became known for the killing of missionaries. Attacks on missionaries had erupted in many parts of China. European Christians were blamed for lots of bad things, such as drought and poverty. For the Germans, the killings of the two missionaries were, of course, only an excuse to move into Kiaozhou. There were three real reasons. First, Germany wanted access to what was regarded the most promising non-European market. Second, the Imperial Navy, I've mentioned that already, needed a coaling station. And third, there was this idea of building a model colony which would showcase German supremacy in the Far East. The German emperor learned about the killings on the 6th of November 1897 and announced that we must take advantage of this, of an excellent opportunity before another great power either dismembers China or comes to her aid, now or never, he said. But before taking action, apparently the German Kaiser, the emperor, obtained an undertaking from the Russian Tsar that Russia would not oppose German military action, which contradicts a bit the understanding that Russia was from the beginning against the German involvement in Georgia, because that was seen as lying within the Russian sphere of influence. The German Imperial Navy arrived in Kiautschou Bay on the 13th of November 1897 with 3 ships from Germany's East Asian Cruiser Division. On the next day, the 14th November 1897, they occupied Kiautschou Bay, where Qingdao is located. And at 6 a.m., 717 officers, petty officers, and sailors armed with rifles landed in Qingdao harbor. Interestingly, the Chinese troops did initially not suspect anything, as it was apparently quite common that foreign troops visited Qingdao. Chinese General Zhang Gaoyan, the commanding officer on the ground, was very surprised, apparently, when he was confronted with an ultimatum to remove his troops within 3 hours. When shortly after 8 a.m. German troops had occupied the main Chinese garrison and artillery battery, the German commanding Admiral Dietrich, who later became the first governor, gave General Zhang 2 days to move his troops of 1,600 to 2,000 from the 4 barracks out of Qingdao. And after consultations with the central government, General Zhang capitulated and ordered his troops to leave Qingdao. Negotiations with the Chinese government followed, and on the 6th of March 1898, the German Empire and the Chinese government signed a lease for 99 years of an area of 553 square kilometers, plus a 50-kilometer wide neutral buffer zone. The territory at that time had about 83,000 inhabitants, of which only 700 to 800 lived in Tsingtao, not counting the troops stationed there. Generally speaking, the population was very poor, so there was not much they could do when the Germans took over. The preamble of the treaty, the lease, translated from the German official version, contained this language, which speaks for itself. The lease contained 3 parts. First, there was a leasing arrangement concerning Kiautschou, then Part 2 concerned railroad and mining concessions, and Part 3 was about priority rights in the province of Shandong. According to Article 1 of the lease agreement, the Chinese agreed to abstain from taking any measures or issuing any ordinances, decrees, without obtaining the prior consent of the German government. That means sovereign rights were transferred to the German Reich. Part 2 was actually the most contentious section of the lease. It provided for the construction of 2 railway lines through Shandong province. Plus, Germany was empowered to mine for coal 15 kilometers on each side of the railways, of the railway lines. And that was the basis for increasing German influence in the whole Shandong province. On the 27th of April 1998, Germany declared Kiautschou to be a German protectorate. The lease entered into force on the 29th April of that year. There was a formal exchange of ratifications in Berlin, actually in the German occasion. It's very interesting that parts 2 and part 3, the commercial parts of the Kiautschou lease, were not made public officially until 10 years later. Legally, the lease was an international treaty between sovereign states, but of course, according to Chinese doctrine, it would qualify as an unequal treaty and would therefore be void. Immediately after the lease had been signed, missionaries stepped up their activities. This provoked protests of Chinese people, especially targeting missionaries, and the protests later turned into what is known as the Boxer Rebellion, carried out by the Chinese secret society Righteous and Harmonious Fists, the Ihre Chuen. The Germans responded with penal expeditions, which expressed aggressive brutality, targeting especially Chinese intellectuals, anti-foreign societies and communities, and symbols of Chinese tradition and religion, in violation of the lease, in violation of Chinese sovereignty. These activities were also done outside the area that was covered by the lease. For example, in March 1899, 40 German troops from Tsingtao completely destroyed the village of Hanjiaotsun. And here and elsewhere, the German action attitude aimed to humiliate local Chinese. In spring 900, of course, the Boxer Rebellion expanded from Shandong, moved towards the capital, Peking, and an international intervention army was set up transporting 88,000 foreign troops to China. Upon bidding farewell to 20,000 German troops, Emperor William II gave his infamous Han speech. He said, "Behave like King Ensel's Hans of 1,000 years ago. No pardoned prisoners will not be made. Act so that no Chinese will ever dare to give a German a strange look." Publicly, the expedition was communicated as a humanitarian intervention, but the real reasons were, of course, others disclosed by Helmut Johannes Ludwig von Moltke, who is then the chief of staff. One does not have to go into the real motive of whole action because, being completely frank, it's the hunger for money which caused us to cut into the big Chinese cake. Empress Dowages Cixi and the court had fled Peking. First, they had supported the Boxers, then they moved against them, and they saw that they would lose. And upon the defeat of the Boxers, she later agreed to an indemnity of 450 million taels of silver. That's an equivalent to $6.6 billion in today's value. Germany took 20%, Russia took 29%, Japan only 7.7%, although Japan had sent the largest contingent of troops. By the way, in December 1956, the Prime Minister of the former German Democratic Republic, Otto Grotewohl, he visited Beijing and handed over to Zhou Enlai 10 banners of the Ichotwan Boxers, which German troops had captured. And this is a photo of this famous event. But back to Kiaozhou. During the time of the German lease, Kiaozhou served as a coaling, repair, and shipbuilding station of the German Army, the German Navy. During the first 7 years of the leasehold, Germany tried to build up its military in the territory, but the Japanese presence in China kept growing, and Germany was quite aware of the fact that they would not be able to defend the territory against the Japanese, and it was therefore agreed that Kiaozhou would, in the first place, serve as a trading post. The model was, of course, Hong Kong. Soon after the lease was signed, German businessmen kept arriving in Tsingtao. There were members of the railway consortium. There was a sausage manufacturer, operators of hotels and restaurants, priests, doctors, pharmacists, handymen, and of course, traders. At the beginning of the 20th century, about 29 German companies operated in Tsingtao. The German Asiatic Bank and other German banks had open branches. But according to Steinmetz, key industries still had to be run by the colonial state because big German companies like Krupp and Siemens, they refused to invest there because they saw risks. The urban commercial sector was mainly run, of course, by Chinese. The Shandong Railway Company ran the Tsingtao-Jinan Railway. It was completed in 1910, connecting Peking and thus the Trans-Siberian Railway with Tsingtao, and made it possible to travel by train all the way from Europe to Tsingtao. Its 14 daily trains carried 640,000 passengers and 700 tons of freight per year, and yet it was never profitable. Others say it was the only profitable operation in Tsingtao, but there are sources which say it always ran a deficit. Now, when the Germans arrived in Tsingtao, sanitary conditions were terrible. Typhoid epidemics in 1899 and 1900 also took German soldiers, and therefore the Germans soon sped up urban development, which eventually reached the highest hygienic standards in Asia. Germany invested between 100 to 200 million Reichsmark, which is about 40 to 80 million US dollars at the time, in the development of the territory. And CUHK became the most expensive overseas engagement of the German Reich, which led to a lot of criticism back in Germany. The biggest portion, 80 million, was spent on the development of a deep water harbor, which needed constant dredging by 1,000 Chinese workers and about 50 European staff. The harbor was opened in 1898. Back to legal issues, land was, of course, very important for the German plans. And one of the first actions that the first governor, Admiral Dietrichson, took was to forbid all land sales in CUHK without his approval. He obtained, in a typical German manner, textbooks to determine who owned what land in the leased territory, and anyone who owned land which the Germans thought they would need for their construction plans was forced to sell at prices determined by the Chinese cadastral surveys. Chinese cities and villages were razed, and the inhabitants were kicked out. There are others who describe the German land policy in much more positive words. You have here a quote from Warner, but I think it was clear that the Germans took what they thought they needed. Tsingtao consisted of several districts: a European district, a villa district, a Chinese trade and commerce district, and 2 districts for workers. You have a map here where you can see this basically is Tsingtao, and then you have the harbor around here. Based on an urban development master plan, Tsingtao City, that had been a very poor fishing village until the Germans arrived, was completely redesigned and redeveloped. And of course, when you visit Tsingtao nowadays, you can still see many of the very German buildings. And yeah, when you go there, it really feels like Germany. According to Fenby, in Tsingtao, the Germans replicated their home surroundings as much as they could. Tsingtao had an electricity plant, a modern hospital, and nursing and convalescent homes, churches and waterworks, a horse racing course, beer gardens, and an observatory. Yeah, there's another German building. And this pavilion may look familiar to you, many of you at least, because you see it on every Tsingtao beer bottle. Everybody knows Tsingtao beer, originally brewed by Germania Brewery. The brewery was founded in 1903. And I must admit, it hurts a little bit to admit this. It was a German-British joint venture. The Anglo-German Brewery Co. Limited was an English-German joint stock company based in Hong Kong. Brewery produced German Pilsner according to German purity rules. And of course, that's pretty much what everybody knows about Tsingtao today. In 1906, the German government buildings and the German government built the first temporary governor residence. This was then later replaced with beautiful governors mentioned. You have photos here, which when I went there to visit really reminded me of the house of my grandparents. The Germans also built 3 prisons. Actually, the house of my grandparents was not as big as the governments mentioned. I must say that it was just the style. The Germans also built 3 prisons, 1 for Europeans and 2 prisons for the Chinese. The initial planning followed the notion of strict separation between the areas for Europeans and for the Chinese. The very modern beach hotel and houses which were linked to the sewage system were only meant for Europeans. The villa district and this is the villa district in Upper Tsingtao with German street names was restricted to for European residents. There was a building code according to which 45% of the land in Upper Tsingtao had to remain without buildings. Therefore, until today, the district has large parks. Millions of trees and bushes were planted, as one has mentioned. From 1910 onwards, the ban of Chinese living in European quarters was gradually lifted, and after 1912, very few areas were really off limits. I will talk about the reasons in a minute. So, Tsingtao became the Brighton of the East. The breeze from the sea kept the temperature down in the early summer and late autumn, attracting holidaymakers from other parts of the country to swim off Auguste Victoria Beach with its rows of bathing huts and strolls on the Kaiser Wilhelm embankment, as it was said. What the Germans were probably most remembered for, apart from the beer, is the educational system, the establishment of a very impressive education system. Kiaozhou had the highest density of educational institutions and the highest per capita enrollment in all of China. Germany established 1 university, 1 government school, 27 grammar schools, and 10 missionary schools and 4 vocational schools. The German-Chinese College, the Deutsche Chinesische Hochschule, was first proposed in 1905, and the establishment of it as a German-Chinese university was approved in 1907. It was opened in 1909. It started with 80 students. In its first year, in 1914, the number had grown to 400 students. It was a prestige object for the German Empire, and the university gained indeed global recognition. Quickly about population numbers. In 1913, Tsingtao had 53,000 to 55,000 inhabitants. That was an increase of 730% over 17 years. The whole territory had an estimated 191,000 inhabitants. According to one source, there were 4,470 Europeans and Americans. 2,400 of them belonged to the German military, and there were 316 Japanese. After the 1911 revolution, also many wealthy Chinese had moved to Tsingtao because it was relatively safe and well organized. Sun Yat-sen reportedly visited Tsingtao in 1912, and he said that the city is a true role model for China's future. At least that's what has been reported. Let's now look at legal aspects of the German concession in Kiaozhou. The lease did not entail a permanent transfer of land to Germany. It is a matter of perspective if the lease was forced upon China as a result of German Empire's gunboat policy, or if the German Empire retreated from outright cession of the area and accepted a leasehold instead, as you can read online. In any way, because there was no cession, technically Chiaozhou never became a colony, although de facto that did not make a difference because sovereignty was transferred altogether to the German Empire. Qingdao was originally a free port modeled on Hong Kong. Customs duties were therefore only charged for goods that passed from Chiaozhou to the rest of China or that were exported. But the free port status was later terminated in 1905. As already mentioned, Chiaozhou was not, unlike other German colonies or concessions, overseas territories, was not supervised by the imperial colonial office, the Reichskolonialamt, but rather under the control of the Imperial Naval Office due to the special importance for the Imperial Navy. As provided in the Protectorate Law, Chiaozhou, that is the military and the civil administration, was led by a governor who reported directly to the Secretary of State at the Imperial Navy Office. During the time of the lease, there were 5 German governors, which you have listed on this chart. And all of them were, by the way, senior Navy officers. The territory had a military administration led by the chief of staff, who was at the same time the deputy governor. The civil administration was managed by a civil commissioner, and there were, of course, other important positions, such as the Chief Justice. There was a commissioner of Chinese affairs. The revenue, the money that the territory needed, was raised by a 6% land tax introduced by one of the early governors. But in fact, unlike most other German colonies, Chiaozhou did not have to support itself because it was subsidized by the Imperial Navy Office and was pretty well off. Qingdao had an imperial court throughout the colonial period, and in 1907 an appeals court was also established. As provided for in the German Protectorate Law, the territory's entire legal system and administrative system was bifurcated. It was a two-system system. It had separate structures for Western civilians, including Japanese, on the one hand, and for the Chinese on the other hand. Chinese who lived in Chiaozhou were also subject to German jurisdiction, but they were not subject to German law. In Chiaozhou, the governor's order on the legal conditions of the Chinese that was enacted in 1899 set out guidelines how for law governing indigenous Chinese. As in other colonies, civil and criminal cases pitting Europeans against natives, against the indigenous population, were to be tried by Germans at the imperial court. German district officers handled purely Chinese civil law cases and criminal law cases according to their interpretation of Chinese law in the 2 district halls of Qingdao and Lutz-Christian. The district officers were German translator trainees, and they were meant to speak and read Chinese. They did not read translations. They were instructed to find out, to learn about local law, Chinese legal views from village elders and local mandarins. And this sounds pretty much like what magistrates did in the new territories under British rule here in Hong Kong, of course. And speaking about Hong Kong, I have to mention the great book by Austin Coates, again, which I read 3 times, and each time I discovered something new and something interesting that I hadn't realized, I hadn't seen before. Now, according to European standards, the Chinese criminal law was too harsh. In criminal cases, therefore, a reference was made to the major criminal acts punishable under German law, but incorporating as much as possible the legal attitude of the Chinese. Chinese residents could be punished for multiple offenses, including while Germans were not subject to Chinese crimes without the equivalent in German law, true double jeopardy. The list of allowable punishments included flogging for male convicts with government-approved instruments, fines, forced labor, temporary or life imprisonment, and with the approval of the government, also the death sentence. Torture was forbidden, but the Chinese, according to Chinese prisoners, it was widely used. The Chief Justice of Dr. Krusen described the system as unique, half German and half Chinese. In an official report, a Denkschrift on Jiaozhou from 1899, one could read the following: the guiding approach in native administration is to habituate the Chinese to the new conditions without effectively limiting the venerable autonomy of the family or their patriarchal living arrangements. We will not intervene in Chinese affairs or the internal governance of their communal affairs, except to the extent required to assure public order or the security in the colony. So they're talking about a colony, but it wasn't one. Unlike the Catholic and Protestant missionaries, the German administration of Jiaozhou therefore did not plan to eliminate Confucianism or change the Chinese way of living. Chinese were not to be turned into Germans. Nevertheless, from the beginning, Chinese citizens were treated as second-class citizens, and segregation was everywhere. There were different European and Chinese differences for Chinese and Europeans in terms of hospitals, schools, prisons, graveyards, chambers of commerce, toilets at the beaches, and even bordellos. In summer 1900, a Chinese order had entered into force, according to which after 9 p.m. Until sunrise the next day, Chinese were not allowed in the streets without a lantern, and when questioned, they had to explain why they were outside. Theater plays required clearance by the Commissioner for Chinese Matters. Chinese were not allowed to join the elite club, Tsingtao Club, or any of the German social clubs, and children of mixed marriages were prohibited from attending German schools. So there was clear segregation from the beginning, and that was in line with the protectorate law. But starting from 1904, the situation in Jiaozhou, at least, began to change. George Steinmetz, in his paper that I have quoted at the beginning, has titled this process being from apartheid to civilizational exchange. What were the reasons for this change of direction? Three factors are proposed: economic pressure, Chinese resistance, German military and foreign policy considerations. Germany had only a small number of troops in China, and it was therefore discussed in Germany how the German influence in China could be increased. And here, apparently, this idea of creating a model colony came up again. While German colonial policy was based on routine segregation, Germans tried to win Chinese elites over by introducing, for example, a special education policy by establishing this quite distinguished and leading in China an education system, and of course the model was the establishment of the university, as discussed before. Germans eventually agreed to let Chinese also participate in mining and railway companies, although there were no Chinese members on the boards of these companies. The ordinance for Chinese, the Chinesenordnung, the ordinance, Chinese order that I mentioned earlier, had specified the relationship between the colonial government and the Chinese indigenous population, specified originally that Chinese were not allowed in European neighborhoods, except of course for the Chinese servants who lived in coolie houses. But in 1914, a law was passed in line with this new policy trend, according to which Chinese could live in the city's European districts. So it was all liberalized. It became segregation was diluted. As early as in 1902, a Chinese Chamber of Commerce, a Chinese committee had been created in Tsingtao with 12 members selected from Chinese merchants from the 3 provincial guilds active in Chiaotao to advise the German government. And since 1909, Chiaotao, Qingdao also had a Chinese Chamber of Commerce. Unlike other German colonies, children of mixed marriages in Chiaotao had the possibility of being legally treated as Germans. Laws forbidding mixed marriages were never really implemented in Chiaotao. Other examples of the changing approach to native policy could be seen, of course, in the educational system. Schools were open for the Chinese, and the German Chinese University, of course, admitted Chinese. But the dualistic system remained formally in place, although the territory was moving towards more legal and cultural equality. On the 12th of June, 1914, this is a chart about the segregation. I think we've covered everything so far. On the 12th of June 1914, the flagship of the British Far Eastern Squadron, the Minotaur, sailed into Tsingtao. And on board was Vice Admiral Sir Thomas Martin Jerram. And he was invited to dine on the Scharnhorst and to dance with German women on the deck of the Gneisenau. Those were the 2 main ships of Germany's East Asia Naval Squadron. They were later sunk off the Falkland Islands in December 1914 during World War I. The visitors were also taken on trips through the hills, and a British officer was said to have remarked with a smile, "Very nice place indeed, 2 years more and we have it." Now, the German control over Chiaotao ended much earlier in 1914. On the 28th of July of that year, the First World War had begun. On the 1st of August, the German governor of Chiaotao declared martial law. On the 15th of August 1914, the Japanese sent an ultimatum to Germany to surrender Chiaotao, to deliver on a date not later than September 15th, 1914, to the Imperial Japanese authorities without condition or compensation the entire leased territory of Chiaotao, with the view of eventual restoration of the same to China. Britain, with which Japan was then in alliance under an agreement that had been signed on the 13th of July 1911, knew and supported the Japanese move. On the 23rd of August 1914, Japan declared war on Germany. Germany had, of course, rejected the Japanese request. After the Japanese declaration of war on Germany, China immediately terminated the CUHK lease agreement, and then the attack on the territory started. According to Fenby, and really this Penguin book is quite a good read, so I can recommend that to you, the one that I quoted earlier. According to Fenby, the German defenders never had a chance. They were cut off from reinforcements and supplies, subjected to heavy rain. Apparently, the rain started in July, went all the way through. The rain washed away their positions, the German positions. The Germans were subjected to heavy and accurate artillery bombardments from small aircraft. Altogether, 32,000 troops were involved. The death toll was less than 500 and fewer than 2,000 wounded, according to Fenby. Again, the Battle of Tsingtao was a tiny affair compared to with the conflict fought in Europe, where hundreds of thousands died. Of course, Germans didn't have a chance. So on the 7th of November 1914, they surrendered to the Japanese and British forces. CUHK was immediately occupied by Japanese. Later, on the 28th of June 1990, the Treaty of Versailles was signed between Germany and Allied powers, which ended World War I. German rights concerning CUHK were transferred to Japan, which of course outraged China. I will talk about that in a couple of minutes. Let's now briefly look at Tianjin and Hankou. Tianjin was and is strategically perfectly located to the east of Beijing, at the seaside, a port city in northern China. After the Second World War, Tianjin had become one of the open ports, and the Qing government was forced to grant concessions to a number of European countries. Altogether, 9 foreign concessions were granted to Britain, France, Germany, Russia, Austria-Hungary, Italy, Belgium, as well as the US and Japan. The British and the French had a head start. They got their concessions after the Pigments Convention of 1860. The other concessions followed between 1895 and 1900. The total area, which you can see here, is about 13 square kilometers. All the square concessions. The blue one, by the way, is the German one, which you see here. There is a river flowing along. We have the Italian over here, and the blue one and the brown one here. That's the British and the French concessions. All the concessions were self-contained. They had their own prisons, their own schools, barracks, and hospitals. They were located south of the Chinese city, which previously was up here. As mentioned, the British and the French had a 25-year head start, so their development was much further than what you had in the other concessions, and therefore most of the foreigners lived in the French and the British concessions. In 1914, Tianjin had about 750,000 inhabitants, plus about 5,400 foreign civilian and 6,000 foreign troops. The German Empire had been involved economically in Tianjin, in the Tianjin area since the late 1870s. In 1895, the German diplomat had requested from the Qing government that Germany be given a concession like Britain and France. The argument was that Germany had forced Japan to return the Liaodong Peninsula during the First Sino-Japanese War. As a result of these negotiations, the Qing government gave in and granted the German Reich a concession in the form of a lease in the Tianjin enclave in 1899. And the total area was originally only 2.2 square kilometers. But after the victory of the Eight Nations Army over the Boxers, Germany forced the Qing government more than the concession size. Germany invested in infrastructure and infrastructure improvements, and German companies and banks, including the German Asiatic Bank, set up business in Tianjin. But many of them had their first address in the British or the French concessions. There was a German consulate also first located in the British concession, barracks that housed 1,400 German troops. There was a Tianjin German club. I'll talk about that in a minute. The Kiesling restaurant, I'll also talk about that, which served Western-style food and which claims to be the first Western restaurant established in China. But most of the firm and business operations, the firms, were located in the more prosperous British concession. Major parts of the German concession remained underdeveloped, or even undeveloped, mainly for financial reasons. I was in Beijing, in Tianjin last week, and of course I searched for traces of the German concession. It was very cold, -9 degrees at night time, but I have to agree with a friend who recently said that Tianjin is probably one of the most underrated Chinese cities. There's so much history all around, and I must say I had a great time there. The renovations and redevelopment in Tianjin focus on the former British concession, the French concession, the Italian concessions, where you can find beautiful European-style villas. Many of them were built after the First World War, where, by the way, many Chinese dignitaries, celebrities, warlords, former warlords, and even Puyi, the last emperor, with family members and staff, lived because that was safer than Peking, and it was still close to Peking, close to the political life. The two residents where Puyi lived are this one and this one, a Spanish-style villa. This is the former Hotel Astor, built in 1863 in the British concession. And here you have some other buildings, a Art Nouveau building that I found. And this is what I mentioned earlier, the German restaurant hotel Kiesling, which was founded in 1901 in the former French concession by a Mr. Albert, whom you see here. That's the one who, the founder of this famous restaurant. Of course, I had stumbled also across the German Club Concordia, established in 1907, located in the former German concession. And of course, I had to have dinner in both places. This is in the Club Concordia, but also in the restaurant Kiesling. These are photos from the Club Concordia, quite impressive and actually very, very German, all this looks like. As mentioned, the German concession's location is a bit off the track, and it was less developed than the French and the British concession. But here's two photos of German buildings used by the empire's military. This one I could locate, and then this one where the leadership was based. And here are photos of other buildings in the German concession. You see the typical red brick, the German style. After China had declared war on the Central Powers in August 1917, China swiftly occupied the German concession and renamed it the First Special District. I will talk a little bit about the end again during the last part. I'll talk about the end of World War I. Now let's talk about Hankow. Hankow was the third German concession. As you may know, in 1953, the three cities of Hankow, Wuchang, and Hanyang merged to become what is now Wuhan. Wuhan is the capital of Hubei province, located where the Han River flows into the Yangtze River. Hankow was one of the ports opened to foreign trade after the Treaty of Tianjin, signed in 1858, which ended the first part of the Second Opium War. Was not ratified, and therefore the war carried on. It was not ratified by the Chinese government, therefore the war carried on. But that's a different story. When I went to Wuhan to give lectures at Wuhan University last year, I discovered how beautiful Wuhan is. I highly recommend it as well. Their lakes, their rivers, it's very beautiful. The German concession war of about half a square kilometer was established on the 3rd of October 1895 in Hankow. In Hankow, there were also a British concession established in 1862, a French concession established in 1886, a Russian concession established in 1886 as well, and a Japanese concession that was established in 1898. Like in Tianjin, the concessions did not have real boundaries, although they were self-sustained, but everybody lived where it suited, including Chinese. Of the 300 Germans, for example, in Hankow, only 1/3 lived in the German concession. British concession had again a development advantage. It had started much earlier, and the other concessions were never able to catch up. In 1911, here you see Hankow, that's a map, and the concession area was along the Yangtze River. Around here, the German concession, I think, was over here. Hankow had, in 1911, Hankow had about 1,750,000 inhabitants. Only 1,350 Westerners, including troops, lived there. Plus 1,500 Japanese and about 27,000 to 28,000 Chinese lived in the foreign concessions. The German concession came into being as a result of the fact that Germany, together with Russia and France, had taken side with China, objected to the Japanese occupation of Port Arthur and promoted the peace of the Shimonoseki after the Sino-Japanese War of 1895-1896. As in the other two concessions, the German concession in Hankow was also based on a lease agreement. Lease fees were very low. The concession, however, was originally not utilized at all like the other foreign concessions. It was small, about 1 kilometer long and 400 meters wide. The development was very slow in the beginning. It started only in 1898. One of the major problems was that the area was close to the Yangtze River, prone to flooding, and reclamation and embankments were needed, and that was expensive and required work. The German-Chinese school for 30 to 40 Chinese pupils was established in 1908, a German school in 1913. In 1915, a German-Chinese engineer school was opened that was located outside the German concession because the German concession was too expensive. Then there was a small Protestant church constructed in 1910. The German police station from those days still exists and nowadays hosts the Wuhan Police Museum. And the German consulate was finished in November 1905 and now hosts the People's Government of Wuhan. Here's some impressions from Hankou, but they're not necessarily from the German concession. Unfortunately, in Hankou, I found that not many of the colonial buildings are left. There's an interesting area, a bustling area. It's interesting to go there, but unlike in Tianjin and in Qingdao, we don't have a real core, a real cluster of colonial buildings that are now utilized for whatever purpose. But here's some impressions of colonial buildings. Behind me, you have to imagine the Yangtze River because the concession area was along the Yangtze River. When you go there at night, it's quite a nice atmosphere. Lots of little restaurants, bars, and shops. Now, the German concession in Hankou ended on the 16th of March 1917 with the end of World War I, and Chinese forces moved in immediately. It became known as the first special area. And with this, there's another building, also in the district. And with this, I'm coming to the end of Germany's colonial engagement in China with the Treaty of Versailles of 1990. The Treaty of Versailles officially ended World War I. It imposed harsh penalties on Germany, including territorial losses, military restrictions, and heavy financial reparations. The Treaty of Versailles, also established, by the way, the League of Nations, of course. Historians claim that because the Treaty of Versailles was so tough on Germany, Germans did not accept it, could not accept this. It was rejected in Germany and contributed to the rise of Hitler and his Nazi party, and eventually led to World War II. The Treaty of Versailles contained a concessions of China clause, according to which Germany ceded its public property in China to the Chinese government, including buildings, wharves, wireless installations, but that only related to Tianjin and Hankou. According to Article 156, the German concession in Shandong were to be transferred to Japan and not to be returned to China. This transfer of Jiaozhou to Japan, of course, triggered outrage and disapproval and fury in China, and eventually led to the May 4th movement. Chinese living in Paris blocked their country's delegations. That was the Republican government's representation delegation. They blocked the entrances of the hotel to prevent them from going to Versailles for the signing ceremony. In Peking, pro-Japanese politicians were attacked by students. The Chinese delegation eventually did not refuse to sign the treaty and did not attend the final ceremony. Of course, during this, China and Japan eventually signed a treaty for the settlement of outstanding questions relating to Shandong at Washington in February 1922, through which Shandong was then returned to China. But of course, during the Second Sino-Japanese War, Japanese forces occupied territory there again from 1937 to 1945. Interestingly, unlike in relation to German colonies in Africa, the German Nazi government did not attempt to recover its colonies and concessions in the Pacific and in China during its time. So the Germans were out of China, and with this, I'm coming to the end of today's seminars. I had mentioned mentioned the traces of German colonial activities in China, but these traces cannot only be found in China. I was in Munich 2 months ago and visited a friend in the district of Trudering, and there I stumbled across a Tsingtao street, which you can see on this Google map here. I had visited Qingdao for the first time in 1984 and vividly remember how German it felt with the red roofs and all those old buildings. I went back in 2024, and in the meantime, of course, a lot of modernization has taken place, in particular when Qingdao hosted the sailing events of the 2008 Beijing Olympics. Nowadays, Qingdao is a beautiful modern seaside city, but Qingdao has also done a lot. The government has also done a wonderful job to protect the old German architecture and remind everybody of the history that is represented by this architecture. When I went to the old town in 2024, I had the same German feelings like in 1804. Locals I spoke to were very, here this is a typical feeling, that's the government mansion in the middle of that green area. Remember, lots of trees were planted. Locals I spoke to were very nice when they heard that I am German. I visited the drainage system set up by the Germans and was proud to read that it prevents flooding during heavy rain until today. Professor Gallagher, Steve, had reminded me that I should mention the German beer, Tsingtao beer, the German origins of Tsingtao beer, but I still find the educational system which Germany had established up in Qiaozhou even more impressive. One other point is interesting, why German culture did not spread from Tsingtao and from Qiaozhou to the rest of China as it had been the plan. The Chinese culture found its way to Germany from Tsingtao. This was mainly the achievement of a man called Richard Wilhelm, who went to Tsingtao at the age of 26 to work as priest, missionary, and teacher. He learned a lot about, got very interested in China and Chinese culture, and learned a lot about the Chinese classics from government officials who had moved to Tsingtao, and from other educated Chinese who had fled to Tsingtao after the 1911 revolution. They all became part of Wilhelm's Confucius Society. He translated many of the Chinese classics into German, and when he returned to Germany in 1924, he founded the China Institute at Frankfurt. In fact, he was the first German sinologist, still very famous, still well known. Apologies, that was my tea. His work changed the German view of China. China was once again regarded as a nation of culture, and that was mainly the result of the work of Richard Wilhelm. But all this should not let us forget that the German Reich, like other colonial powers, had bullied their way into China using gunboat strategies, using force, using brutality. The Germans did not force opium upon China as the British did, but there was brutal German repression throughout the German presence in China, and in particular after the Boxer Rebellion. Most importantly, the notion of German colonialism as colonialism of other foreign powers in China and elsewhere can, of course, under no circumstances be justified legally or morally. I would like to finish with a quote from a letter by a Chinese statesman, Ku Hongming, And this letter was sent to one of my favorite English writers, W. Somerset Maugham, in 1921, which I found in this great book by Amitav Ghosh, which discusses the opium plot of the British in detail. It's really a very good read, and I can recommend that to you. So Ku Hong Ming wrote, do you know that we tried an experiment that is unique in the history of the world? We sought to rule this great country not by force, but by wisdom. And for centuries, we have succeeded. Then why does the white man despise the yellow? Shall I tell you? Because he has invented the machine gun. And what will become of your superiority when the yellow man can make as good guns as the white and fire them as straight? You have appealed to the machine gun, and by the machine gun shall you be judged. I will stop here. Thank you very much for attending today's seminar and for your support all along of the Greater China Legal History seminar series. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lutz. A comprehensive consideration of the German colonialism in China. Really interesting, lots of interesting things. Yes, I can see that you are drawing the distinction between British colonialism and German colonialism. As you pointed out at the beginning, it didn't sound very good with Kaiser Wilhelm's ideas of what should go on and the iron collar and everything else. But I suppose, yes, colonialism by beer rather than by opium. I suppose it's a much better thing. But thank you also for pointing out that it must have hurt you to say that the company actually brought beer into Qingdao was also partly British owned as well. So some good influence maybe from the British and the Germans together there in beer culture. But thank you. That was really, really fascinating and lovely photographs as well. Thank you also for promoting all those wonderful places that, you know, those of us who haven't been there yet, we all want to go and visit these places now as well, which is always a good thing for these seminars as well as the comprehensive consideration of the legal regime. So a few questions have already come in. Let me start with this one, which I must admit is very interesting to think about this. What was the relationship between Germany and the Chinese government during the time of the three concessions? Did China fight, simply accept, or even appreciate the German presence in China?
Thank you. Well, we're talking about times when the Chinese government had to deal with lots of issues, internal issues throughout the whole period. There was a revolution, there were invaders, and therefore, I think the Qing government first and then the Republican governments had a lot of internal issues to deal with. So dealing with foreign powers was quite difficult because that, of course, required a lot of power. But interestingly, over the entire German period, apparently the Chinese government and the German authorities were struggling with the definition of what the Qingdao, with the Kiaozhou concession was. The Germans, of course, kept saying that this was a German protectorate, and the Chinese officials in Peking and from other areas, they pointed out that this was a leasehold. The Chinese apparently also suggested that there should be some Chinese representation in Qingdao. State officials should be stated there, and the German response was that they were not the sovereign there, and they regard this as an attack on their German sovereignty, and they therefore granted citizenship to the Chinese born in Kiaozhou, who were protected from extradition and had the right to residence. Yuan Shikai, who later became the president of the Republic of China from 1912 to 1916, I think, he was governor of Shandong from 19 to 1901. And he worked with some success against the Germans and against the government in Kiaozhou, undercutting, for example, mining activities in the province And he also kept reminding the Germans that there was a limited lifespan, and it was actually only a leasehold that the Germans had in Jiaozhou. So there was some tension, but I think that the government, Qing government first, and the Republican government later, they had too much on their hands to really deal with this.
Thank you very much. I'm just scanning the other questions that are coming in now, because I know that we're sort of rapidly running out of time. But one quick one. Would you please share the name of the English writer that you quoted from at the conclusion? I think that was that a letter to Somerset Maugham, wasn't it?
Exactly, yes.
So
he, of course, has written very nice books, A Painted Veil, which plays in China, and it's a great writer.
Okay, thank you. Hong Kong's success was partly contributed to by British decolonization. Would Germany also contribute some of the benefits to Shandong and even China?
Yes, of course, Germany remained involved. I remember that Bavaria, for example, has a partnership with Shandong province. So there is still a lot of collaboration, cooperation, and when I was in Tianjin last week, I saw lots of signs of German organizations supporting initiatives there. That's what it was.
Okay, and thank you. And this one, in a week where we shared a memory about a seminar that we organised 8 years ago with our now present colleague Dr. C. Lin on unjust enrichment, comparing unjust enrichment in Germany, in England, and in China. Do you see lasting influences of German colonial legal practices in modern Chinese legal development?
Well, the German legal system has been very influential in China, in particular in the private law area. You may know that the German Civil Code, I think we've spoken about that, is very abstract, which makes it very complicated, and people argue not really close to practice, but it's easy to be transplanted. And many Chinese professors and practitioners have been educated in Germany. Last but not least, the German Civil Code, German legal culture was adopted in Japan, through Japan and Taiwan, and through that it has ended up, of course, in China. I'm always stunned by similarities between Chinese law and German law. There was certainly a lot of influence, also supported by the German government, because there were delegations and there was development aid in the terms of legal advice when it came to creating the new legal system after 1978.
First of all, let me thank all of you for joining us. As I said, an incredible number. We should have expected it with Lutz talking about such an interesting subject, but over 1,000 people registered and great attendance. A great seminar. Let's thank Professor Lutz-Christian Wolff once again for a really interesting seminar in the Greater China Legal History Seminar Series. Thank you all for joining us. We look forward to seeing you at the next seminar. Bye-bye.